What in the fuck's sake is that? He said, looking at the heavy metal spirit, halfway protruding from the steel orb, floating beside me. Bad man no need to know, Spirit exclaimed as he pressed his hands onto the steel sphere, pulling the bottom half of his body from it, forming it back into the armor, before kicking out the sphere, launching himself out towards him. In the moment, all he did was react. Seeing that armored suit flying in his direction, he lashed out with a punch at it, striking it dead center, but instead of flying backward like me, suddenly the centerpiece for the armor simply tore itself into a liquid as his fist propelled its way through, splattering to the other side, as Spirit grabbed the arm propelling through its chest. I got you now, bad man, it exclaimed as it broke down into a liquid, whirling around his form. Suddenly, his entire body was a whirl in liquid steel, the armor propelling itself from places, steely arms protruding from nowhere to punch him in the face, grasping at him in places, whirling around him from behind, before appearing out again in the shape of the armor, punching him multiple times in the back of the head. Bad man! Bad man! Bad man hurt people! The heavy metal spirit's punches were rapid, and you could hear each and every impact like a small shockwave that rung off against his head, as he finally gained enough sense to reach behind, grabbing the armor piece and trying to tear the heavy metal spirit off of his form. But while he was doing that, he suddenly noticed a very large ball of metal flying in his direction, impacting him center of the chest, sending him hurtling backwards, cratering into the ground, tearing a path through the road as he propelled himself backwards, burying him deep into the cement, as the heavy metal spirit came propelling out of the other side of the orb, jumping back as the orb continued to press him down further, before finally coming to a stop, with the meathead on the other side. For a second it was quiet, before an explosion ripped out, the heavy metal sphere flying off of him, as I caught it as it moved through the air, flying away. You're dead! Dead, you hear me? He exclaimed as he crawled his way out of the crater furiously. I'm gonna break every bone in your body. Mail them to all your friends and family once I rip them off. Bad man angry. Good. Bad man deserved butt whoop, the heavy metal spirit exclaimed, as I took my place standing beside him, pulling the heavy metal sphere to orbit above us, as he stared at us furiously. Doesn't matter how many of you there are, I'll rip you all apart, he said as he lashed out, beginning to dart in our direction rapidly, and suddenly the street became a battlefield, as I began to change the heavy metal sphere into smaller spheres that I could move around more easily, firing them out at him like cannonballs. He was surprisingly agile for his size, managing to slip between them as he moved in our direction, and the heavy metal spirit took off, running towards him, and I did the same, pulling the remainder of the liquid steel that I hadn't fired at him with me. Suddenly, the entire street was awash with movement and destruction, as he lashed out with one punch and swing after another, smacking the heavy metal spirit into a nearby car. As he reached out for me, I evaded, wrapping metal around his arm, and then trying to anchor it into the ground. Unfortunately, he just ripped it out, pulling a massive amount of cement along with it. I barely managed to evade as he swung it out at me, but it slowed his movement enough that I could move in. I darted in towards center, giving him an uppercut to the chin. It rung his bell a bit, but it wasn't enough to shake him. Damn it, this guy was durable. As the heavy metal spirit jumped on his back, wrapping a band of its arm around his neck, fusing it back into his chest as he began to try to tighten it, trying to choke him out. As it did, I propelled one of the heavy metal cannonballs that I had fired at him back, pulling it out of its place in the concrete, streaking across the ground low, slamming into one of his legs and taking it out from under him. As I pulled the rest of the heavy metal next to me into a fist, a massive one, slamming it into his chest. burying him down into the asphalt again, as the heavy metal spirit tried to harden the grasp around his neck. As it did, he lashed out with a kick, propelling the fist I had smashed him with off to the side, kicking it away. As he reached up, grasping hold of the ring of steel wrapped around his neck, attempting to tighten it, beginning to pull at it furiously. It was hardened heavy metal, and yet the force that he was pulling with was immense. I could hear it warping as he finally snapped through it, breaking the band and then swinging the heavy metal spirit down into the ground. Spirit quickly whirled himself back together, turning back into a liquid partially, his remaining hardened parts shifting across his form, while his center mass reconstructed itself until he once again looked like a doppelganger of me, now standing on his feet again. And for a while, the battle continued like that, back and forth, hits being flung from both sides as the conflict continued. I was throwing everything I had at him, but the bastard was just so durable. He was right. He was like an armored suit. It was a major problem. Regardless of how hard I hit him, he never stayed down. The only things really heavy enough to do damage required me to accumulate large amounts of the liquid steel into single one-off shots, but even those only really shook him for a moment. They weren't enough to put him down. This bastard was so strong and far more agile than I would have given him credit for. He started being able to evade the large-scale attacks, leaving only the smaller hits being able to make contact, but not doing enough damage to really stop him. I needed something that would put him down for good, but he wasn't going to sit around and wait for it. He'd dodge anything that I just tried to propel at him, and I already know that liquid steel bindings aren't going to hold this guy. He's too strong. I don't have enough of it yet, not to truly lock him down. How do I hit him hard enough to put him down? I thought as the conflict raged, dodging blow after blow, as he lashed out, managing to grab hold of me, pulling me in tight, and beginning to try to squeeze me. This is the real one, ain't it? All I gotta do is crush you in that little armored suit of yours, and this is over. The heavy metal spirit lashed out, extending its arms into long whip-like sections, with large spheres on the end of them, beginning to whip the hardened spheres at the end at him over and over again, in rapid motion. I could feel the impacts as they rang into him, hard enough to cause shockwaves. I could tell he was feeling them. They weren't slight blows, but he didn't relinquish his grip on me. "You're not going anywhere until I squeeze the life out of you," he exclaimed as his grip hardened, tightened around me. I could feel it crushing me as I pointlessly tried to press against it. "This isn't good." In the moment, I pulled the liquid steel that I had gathered around, beginning to whirl it into the section where he was squeezing me, hardening it and then stacking more, then bringing in more and hardening that as well, forming bracers in between his arms, extending the space by force. As he tried to squeeze in harder, I just added more liquid steel. He tried squeezing to warp his way through it, but there was too much. Finally, the gap extended enough that I slid out, hitting the ground and then rolling backwards, still being able to feel the pain in my arms and chest. And there were heavy warps in sections of my armor as I focused to return them back to normal. I definitely don't want to do that again," I said as he tried to pull himself free of the liquid steel, beginning to warp the segments of metal attached to him. I noticed it was taking a second for him to do it. He was strong, even strong enough to warp the heavy metal in its hardened state. But the more of it there was, the harder it was for him to do. And in the moment, an idea popped into my head, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit happy about it. Yeah, I think that'll give me enough time. It looks like all of my training, using the heavy metal to lift weights, is gonna pay off after all. He's one heavy bastard, but I think I can manage it. "Okay, big guy, I'm about done with this shit show. I'm bringing this to an end, heavy metal style. Tell me, you like roller coasters? 'Cause you're about to go on a ride, I exclaimed as I gathered all of the liquid steel, forcing it to pour in on his form from all directions as he began to try to lash out, force it from gathering. But there was too much of it, as I gathered every drop that I had to spare, looking over to the heavy metal spirit. Hey buddy, let's fly, I said, as Spirit gave me a nod. Yeah, fly, bad man, Spirit exclaimed as he broke himself down into liquid, whirling around my form, this time creating absolutely massive wings, far bigger than were actually needed to carry me. We were definitely gonna need it, because we're about to teach this guy a serious lesson about gravity. In that moment, I hardened the heavy metal around him until he looked like he was wearing a steel ball around his entire midsection, just his arms and his head sticking out of it, as he struggled to move from the inside of it. What the hell? In the moment, a flap coming off from my wings, propelling me into the air above him, as a stream of heavy metal reached up in chains, one after another, gathering to a grip section that I grasped hold of, beginning to lift, both with the wings attached to my body, complements of the heavy metal spirit, with my physical strength as well, and on top of that, lifting all of the heavy metals surrounding his body as he tried his best to try to tear his way out. But with so much of it, that was proving a difficult proposition, as he began to raise from the ground, lifting into the air as I lifted along with him, as I began dragging him into the sky, farther and farther. You little shit! You gonna pay for this! I'm gonna rip you limb from limb! He exclaimed as he tried to tear himself free furiously, reaching out and trying to break the heavy metal chains. But every time he succeeded in snapping one, I only reformed it, creating a new chain to replace it, as he struggled against the tide, pulling ourselves further and further up, beyond the buildings, above the skyscrapers, until finally the entire city could be seen from beneath, thousands of feet up. Suddenly, I gave one more hard yank to the heavy metal sphere that was wrapped around him, lifting him up for just a moment, as for an instant he almost probably felt weightless, as gravity began to take hold. I'm sorry, sir. You've reached the top of the elevator shaft. Only one direction left, and I'm afraid it's down, I said as the heavy metal wings beat, forcing me down as I pressed my hands into the sphere wrapped around his body, and we began propelling down towards the ground rapidly as I flapped the heavy metal wings, pressing us down faster and faster. At that point, the panic started to hit him as he looked down at the ground that was approaching more rapidly by the second. You can't do this to me. You're gonna pay. You're gonna pay, he exclaimed as we darted towards the ground. As it began to grow closer and closer, finally I started allowing myself to distance from the sphere, reforming it so that the sphere itself wouldn't protect him, only acting like an object forcing him down with no protection on the other side, but still locking his arms and legs to it in a fashion where it wouldn't be easy to get out, and with everything I had, beat my wings in order to slow my movement. And while I did that, using my telekinetic force to press the steel ball on top of him down as hard as I could, a shockwave rang out from the air as it propelled itself down even farther, even faster. I could still hear him screaming bloody rage as he flew down towards the surface, smashing into it, an explosion that sent concrete flying, cars twirling through the air, a massive crater in the ground below. Water shot out from a hydrant that was basically destroyed from the impact as I finally approached the ground behind him, landing just outside of the crater, looking down into it to see that he had shattered his way through the base level down into the sewer, and there he was, sprawled out in sewage water, this time He was down. And that is what you call an ass whooping. Muscle-bound douche.